intriguing combination of Kremlinology and Trumpology. And you never thought that these would be two conversations we'd be merging in one here in Washington. And I was trying to think, well, how are we going to do this tonight? How do we split it up? Russia, United States, usually those have been very separate discussions. And then I thought, well, maybe I'll start with a joke that is actually in our book about Russia, but was something that I used the other day when somebody asked about the state of democracy in America under President Trump. And the joke that we heard one time when we were in Moscow from Grigory Yavlinsky, who was one of the leading sort of liberal opposition figures to Vladimir Putin. And this was the 10th anniversary of the Carnegie Moscow Center. And they had a big forum. Of course, everybody was still wondering, it was relatively early on in Vladimir Putin's tenure, what exactly is going to happen to democracy in Russia? What's going on with Putin? And Yavlinsky said, well, this reminds me of an old Soviet anecdote, an old joke we used to tell in the Soviet times about an ambulance driver. He picks up a guy who seriously got some big problems. They're driving through the Moscow traffic. All of a sudden, the ambulance driver turns not in the direction of the hospital, but starts headed toward the morgue. The guy in the back recognizes the change in direction. He sits up, he says, hey, where are you going, buddy? I'm not dead yet. Don't take me to the morgue. The ambulance driver turns around and he says, yes, but we're not there yet. So, people used to laugh at that. Of course, we know the answer in Russia, right? The ambulance driver made the correct turn, ended up at the morgue. Democracy is not really what we're talking about when we think about Vladimir Putin's Russia. I never thought that's a joke that I would use and people would laugh at as if it made any sense at all in the context of the United States. But here we are in a day and age when we're having a lot of previously unthinkable conversations about the White House. So I provided my opening, which is really just like, I want to ask my husband here. He has covered the White House for President Clinton, second term, mostly. President Bush, second term. All 8 years of Barack Obama. And now, 100 days, it feels like, at times 100 years, of Donald Trump. We're having a lot of previously unthinkable conversations, including questions about democracy in America. How different really is the Trump White House than the previous White House?
I wasn't told this was going to turn into an interview. This is going to be interesting. It is true, it's only been 96 days. It feels like it's been a little bit longer. Every day feels like a week, every week feels like a month. Somebody tweeted the other day, they said, if you only have 1 year to live, 2017 is the year. It's going to go on forever. So far, I think that's true. I want to start by saying, by the way, a little full disclosure here. I see a couple of ringers in the audience, at least a couple of ringers here, who, to the extent that I had any training in journalism, it was the hands of a couple people in the audience here who, early on in Fairfax County, when I covered schools and the county board, were kind enough to be public figures and to give me interviews and news, and tell me when the articles were wrong. Never said when the articles were right, but I took that as a compliment if nothing was said. And so anyway, I want to welcome Kate Hanley and Joanne Whitney who are here tonight. Very honored that you're come in. So this White House, fourth White House, and what strikes you every time a new White House comes in is they think they have started history all over again. Right? Every new president thinks nothing happened until they became president. They're the first one to ever do this. I have the most Greek friends of anybody, any president ever. I remember Bill Clinton actually said that. No president ever had as many Greek friends as he did. He was the most this and the first this, and all of them think nothing happened until they became president. When George W. Bush came to office, he declared the end of the Cold War. Never mind that it ended 10 years earlier under his father. Every president thinks they are the first one, and it's something completely new under the sun. Well, finally, we actually found a president who is, in fact, very new under the sun. This is definitely a different president and a different White House than any of the previous ones we've seen. Not always for the reasons he says, but in ways we couldn't possibly have anticipated. You know, we were based briefly in Jerusalem for about 5 months, and they brought us home, and I think the paper thought, well, we better have somebody who's been at the White House before cover this one. And actually, in the end, that experience is the exact wrong experience, I think, for covering this White House, because it sets up expectations that make no sense whatsoever. Every time I'm in a meeting with the editors, I used to say things like, well, this is the way a president might look at this, or this is the White House would never do it this way. Throw those expectations out the window. They have no bearing whatsoever on this White House. Things you would never thought would have happened with great regularity. Not only great regularity, there's the pace of events and news. Do anybody remember that he fired the Attorney General? That was, I think, in the first week. Does anybody, you know, the day that Judge Gorsuch was made Justice Gorsuch, it was a below-the-fold story. It wasn't even the lead story of the day. When Devin Nunes stepped down as the head of the committee investigating the Russia situation, I thought that was going to be the big news of the day. I was 9 in the morning. By the time the end of the day had come around, it was inside the story, inside the paper the next day, because so many other things happened that day, including the Syria strike and the end of the filibuster in the Senate and so forth. So we are hamsters in a wheel, moving as fast as possible, trying to understand a president who does not consider the boundaries that other presidents did, and it's fascinating. And the overlap with Russia does make it more interesting, and we have yet to figure it out. So what I want to ask you.
You really answer my question.
I did. It's never different. You said, how is it different? Well, I mean, you know, have you ever had a president accuse his predecessor of wiretapping him? Have you ever had a president who imagined 3 million illegal voters who came out to all vote against him in order to cost him the popular vote? I mean, none of these things, you know, has any bearing in evidence or fact, and yet you know, other presidents took great care in trying to say what they said. They didn't always tell the truth, by the way. It's not the first president who said things that weren't true. But previous presidents, I think, were more worried about getting caught. And a little bit more, you know, look for justification for the things that they said that might have been exaggerations or spin. So my question to you is, what do you make of this Russia thing? Is there something there that Americans should be concerned about? One thing everybody agrees on is Russia tried to meddle in the election. Okay, that part we agree on. But what else? What about all these contacts? Should they matter? Should we be worried about it? What do we actually know and not know?
Well, I mean, first of all, I think it's a striking fact that often gets lost in the political theater of all this. And we're all like, you know, it's talk about reality TV show presidency. Not only is Trump a reality TV show president, but in many ways we're all characters in the drama. You know, it's in many ways more like the Truman Show than it is like The Apprentice, in the sense that we're all
not the Harry Truman Show.
we're all in the story. And so I think the exhausting nature of us all participating in the news cycle every day at this frenetic pace is that it becomes very hard in the blur to remember, you know, sort of what are the really salient facts. And the really salient fact is, number one, the Russian meddling in the U.S. election, in the American political process, was really, truly, not only unprecedented, but a very significant thing. And, you know, that's why you have Dick Cheney and other Republicans absolutely disregarding Trump's efforts to downplay this and saying, no, this is akin to an act of war. It's a very serious thing. Now, that doesn't mean we know what to do about it, but I think that gets lost in the fog a little bit. This is a very big deal. And remember, the conclusion of the U.S. intelligence agencies across all 17 of them, because yes, we have a lot of different intelligence agencies, is not only that they tried to intervene in the election, but explicitly did so on behalf of one candidate, on behalf of Trump. Number two, something that also gets lost in the mix. Not all investigations of Russia are created equal. You know, there may well be a House investigation, a Senate investigation, an FBI investigation. The one that matters is the FBI investigation, and that really matters, especially with the integrity of the FBI really being called into question, given Director Comey's late intervention right before the voting in November in ways that are still being debated over. There was a 5,000-word story in the New York Times just this weekend. I read it. It was long. Attempting to, sort of reconstruct this. And I think even that was ultimately a pretty frustrating exercise at, great diligent journalism. But in the end, right, you read that 9,000 words and, you want to know a lot more about the Trump investigation piece of it. And you don't really come away satisfied that the folks around Comey and Comey himself have really fully come to terms with the consequences of making a decision that seems so disproportionate, right? That you have two factors that weren't, two investigations that were not treated in the same way. And what are the long-term consequences for the FBI? And how is that going to affect the ongoing investigation of Trump? I think it's a serious one.
Well, I want to ask you though, because Susan was editor of Politico last year during the campaign cycle, so she dealt with all these guys, all these people out there, the Hillary Clinton campaign, Donald Trump campaign. She knew Sean Spicer before he was Sean Spicer. So,
and by the way, he was totally like this. All those people, and I know people are in stories that say like, oh, I don't know what's happened to Sean since he took over with us. I found his behavior in this job very, very consistent with the performance that we saw when he was at the RNC.
Well, let me ask you a question. So, because you covered the election, she led a team of 200 reporters covering the election. You have a better insight than most of us into that election. What do you think about the Russian interference? Did the Russian interference change the outcome? A. And then B, did Director Comey's handling of it change the outcome? The second one is different from the first.
Look, nobody really knows, and of course, in a close election that was decided by only a few tens of thousands of votes in 3 states, we can say any particular factor that might have ultimately changed the outcome had it gone differently. And even the Clinton campaign officials that I've spoken with since the election recognize that. Now, Hillary Clinton has said publicly the only factor she's really honed in on specifically is the Comey intervention right before the election. It is my view that is the very decisive, sort of shift in momentum in the campaign, and even the numbers jockeys who look at it, that's the only factor for which you can actually look and say, okay, well things changed pretty specifically and dramatically from that point forward. So I have always felt that it was shocking, and anyone at the time. Even look back to that Friday afternoon, and I remember very clearly it was a Friday afternoon, it was at lunchtime because I went to see a friend of mine because we were going to be moving to Jerusalem, and I went to have lunch with her at the restaurant at the museum, and that sensation that you have when you realize you're, sort of a hinge point in time, and you remember a big event because of, where you were or how you missed it or whatever, the occasion. I remember being in the taxi on the way back to my office for lunch, and I was so proud I hadn't looked at my phone during lunch. And, I wasn't under any illusion. The second I saw that, I understood very clearly this was a dramatic, unprecedented event. It was a break with protocol that was almost breathtaking, and that it was going to have a significant consequence. So that's my view of it. You may disagree. You've always been more skeptical of the idea that the Comey intervention, or whatever you want to call it, that it was significant but might not have proved decisive in some way. Is that still your view?
Well, I think what I would say is, on the first point, there doesn't seem to be any evidence that the Russian intervention changed the outcome, at least so far. It obviously had a factor in the conversation because they had these leaked emails, and that certainly threw the Clinton campaign off its game from time to time. No question that wasn't a helpful thing to the Clinton campaign. I don't know that necessarily, I don't know if anything John Podesta said in his emails changed votes per se. And there doesn't seem to be any evidence that their tampering extended beyond what we know in terms of that kind of thing. But the Comey thing, I think, obviously was an important factor, and I don't think you can discount that in the final outcome for sure. I think there are other factors, is the thing. One, you can argue that first of all, the email thing was her fault to begin with because nobody made her have an email server outside of the State Department, and so Comey wouldn't have had to investigate if there hadn't been a decision in the first place that was proved to be unwise. And secondly, the biggest questions are Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Ohio, since those are the three states that she lost that actually changed the outcome of the Electoral College. Because she still won the popular vote. She won 3 million more votes than he did. So more Americans chose her on election day than chose him.
Gosh, you're trolling for a Trump tweet, aren't you?
I know, yeah.
Maybe he's watching.
Yeah. But she obviously had problems specifically in those 3 states that also have to be considered when you look at the at why she lost, and the broader question of Democrats and working class and labor households that had once been such a powerful core constituency for the Democrats obviously didn't come through, and the failure to see what was happening in those Midwest states can't be ignored.
So we should probably go back to the investigation itself for a second, and I wanted to make a point, and then I want to ask you a question. So as far as the FBI investigation goes, one of the things I think, right, is that the ineluctable logic of these investigations is that once they start, you don't know where they're going to end, and often, in fact, the charges that end up resulting from a big, serious investigation like this don't end up having to do with the initial thing that triggered the investigation in and of itself. And that's often the lesson that that's Watergate, that's many other Washington-type scandal investigations. And here, it started because of this question that we're still don't know the answers to about whether there was any alleged collusion between the Trump campaign and the Russian hacking of the election. It may well turn out, because we already have a whole series other bucket of allegations that clearly seem to be wrapped up into this FBI investigation already, which was what the Trump people did after the election. And talking about former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn, and did he lie to Congress? Did he lie on his federal ethics forms? Did he lie in the disclosures he was required to fill out? Was he improperly engaged in policy discussions with the Russian ambassador or others? Was the Trump team making commitments about changing U.S. policy on the sanctions before they were sworn into office? That's a whole other bucket of potential questions which we believe the FBI also to be investigating, which fundamentally don't necessarily reflect on the original question, which is still a very important question, which was, how did they know? Did they know about the hacking of the DNC emails in advance? Did they know about the hacking of John Podesta's emails and the timing of their meetings? Were they coordinating in some way? And those are all serious questions. There could be additional questions that arise in the course of doing this. Once you have the FBI, looking under your rock, you just don't know what's going to happen. And I think that is really important reminder for folks. But my question is, how do you look at how this affects policy towards Russia? And the Kremlin part of this Trumpology. What is this going to mean in terms of, I'm completely confused as of day 96. What is our policy toward Russia? And are we opening up a new Cold War with them, or are we reconciling with them?
Right. It depends on the day. That's a great question, actually a very important question, because we thought after the election that there would be this new reset. Now, Trump was never going to use that term because it was tainted by association with President Obama and Hillary Clinton. But he was speaking very favorably about Vladimir Putin. He was speaking very positively about the relationship with Russia. Clearly was downplaying things like the Crimea annexation, the Ukraine intervention. So we expected him to come in and suddenly we're going to be best friends with the Kremlin again. In fact, there was a plan early on to go ahead and drop some of these sanctions that President Obama had imposed just before leaving office because of the election intervention. Well, that got stopped. And that plan got stopped partly because Republicans in the Senate said, wait a second, you may want to be friends with Vladimir Putin. We're not convinced. Sine qua non of being a Republican is deep skepticism of Russia, and that hasn't changed because Donald Trump says otherwise. So he dropped the initial plan to lift some of these sanctions. And as this investigation has continued to generate questions and heat, and it should be said that so far, publicly at least, all the officials have said they don't have concrete evidence of collusion. That's important that we know for the moment. Doesn't mean that that's their final conclusion. That's their current state of understanding of things that we've been told. But because of all of the questions, because of the odd nature of the president's affinity for a strongman that very few other people in the West would embrace like this, it actually has in fact changed policy. Now, because of the suspicions, though, I think it's actually meant the chances of a reconciliation or some sort of collaboration are actually worse in some ways than they might have been. Because people wonder, well, why is he doing this? Why do they want to work together? Put aside the Syria strike for a second when we had this big, blow up over Russia's role in Syria. You heard Donald Trump, President Trump, very clearly still holding out the possibility that there could be, a collaboration. He did not say mean things about Putin himself. He said, well, we're at a low point right now in our relationship with Russia, and Russia shouldn't have done this or that. He didn't ever say Putin specifically, and he did not troll him on Twitter, which is a way of measuring it. He'll troll anybody within the boundaries of the United States, including Meryl Streep, the Saturday Night Live star, Donald Schwarzenegger, Republicans, Democrats, and judges and media. He has not trolled once Vladimir Putin, or for that matter, Bashar al-Assad. But I think the whole thing is so complicated now because of this investigation. People always wonder, well, why would you want to cooperate with them? What's the trade-off here? Why would you let them do this in favor of that? Ironically, Hillary Clinton, maybe like Richard Nixon going to China, would have had an easier time finding ways to collaborate with Russia because she wouldn't have been suspected quite as easily of having a conflict there with him. So I think that the relationship with Russia, very complicated. The Russians, if they feel like they got a winner out of this last election, are now rethinking it. Their market went up originally and then started going down once they realized things were not going to work out the way they wanted. Their television, which was praising Trump, as a Putin of America, is now very down on Trump right now, and that's a direct on orders of the Kremlin. So I think it's complicated, and I don't know what There's a lot of reasons why you might want to have cooperation with Russia on a lot of things, even though they do things that we sanction and otherwise criticize, because they are an important player when it comes to Iran, they are an important player when it comes to North Korea, and they are an important player when it comes to Syria. So President Obama, like President Bush before him, believed in tough measures on the relationship, compartmentalizing to some extent to try to work with them on others. That's going to be real hard now, and I don't know how that plays out. Okay, my question to you then. So, what is Vladimir Putin's goal at this point? He's now been in office. We arrived in Russia right around the time he took office. He's now been there for 17 years. There's not an election coming up, I guess, in next year, and it would be for a 6-year term. Where is Putin going at this point? Can he ever step down? Is he there for life? Is there ever going to be an option? We saw people in the streets a few weeks ago. Where do you see Putin's Russia going?
Well, the view is a little hazy from here on the Potomac. Sarah Palin has a better view in but it actually, right? It is pretty hazy here from the Potomac, and that's the interesting thing about people saying, well, this is a Russia-obsessed movement in American politics, but in many ways, the Russiagate story is really about American politics. And then there's the separate story of, why is Vladimir Putin doing this? The Kremlin has turned, outward, aggressively, not just policing within its own borders, but taking over Crimea, launching a war in eastern Ukraine in the last few years, getting very involved in Syria's civil war in a way that Russia had not done since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Basically projecting force outside of its borders has been the dramatic turn of Vladimir Putin in his presidency in the last few years. And so, what does that mean? Is that a sign of increasing confidence or insecurity? And that's the thing. The smart Russian hands that we know have always come around to the view that in the end, Putin's insecurity and the fundamental instability of the regime in the Kremlin has driven a lot more of the decisions of Russia and how to conduct itself in the last few years than we tend to realize here in the United States or even in Western Europe. We tend to see things through our lens, but that, really, fundamentally, Putin has amassed enormous power inside Russia, but it's a very brittle regime. And, that's been true, of course, for a long time. In the absence of genuine democratic small d institutions inside Russia, I think one of the consequences of that, basically, is that, change, the old saying has in Russia, when it comes, happens like quickly and very violently, very bloodily, right? Because there's no interposing system there. You can't work it out through the normal jawboning of the democratic process. You have a fake parliament, you have a fake media, you have an almost non-existent civil society in many ways. So
their media really is fake.
Well, that's right. That's
to be clear. So you wrote a piece a few weeks back, actually a couple months back, for the New York Times, actually, in our Sunday Review section, comparing what we saw, you and I saw, in Putin's early days to what we thought we might be seeing in the early days of Donald Trump. Not the same, it's a very imprecise comparison, we should caveat that. But tell us about that. I mean, what do you see? What are the comparisons? What do you feel a sense of flashback here? Does that mean that there's things going to happen here that will be similar to Russia, and how has it played out quite the way you thought it would?
Well, I mean, first of all, so the point that I was trying to make there is we don't know what's going to happen in the Russiagate scandal. We don't know if there was collusion or not. But put that aside for a moment. That might not be the biggest issue. The real cause for concern, I think, is the fact that President Trump has shown more disdain for democratic small d institutions than any president of the United States of my lifetime, of the modern era. And what we happened to witness at this particular moment in time was the consolidation of power back in the Kremlin. Basically the dismantling of the fragile, small, not yet fully rooted democratic institutions that has started to take hold in Russia after the end of the Soviet Union. And by the way, that's a playbook that Vladimir Putin has operated successfully under. It's a playbook that President Erdogan in Turkey has been operating under. It's a playbook that is familiar, to many would-be strongmen. Viktor Orban, the leader of Hungary, a member of the European Union, calls his system that he's putting in place illiberal democracy. And right now in Hungary, one of the great success stories, supposedly, of what it meant to have communism collapse 25 years ago. Viktor Orban is trying to destroy a university because it's funded by George Soros that has been like a major new institution of bringing those democratic values to Central and Eastern Europe. And, it's very interesting that both conservatives and liberals alike have banded together to try to fight this. So, call it illiberal democracy, call it autocracy, call it strongman rule. What's amazing is that in his publicly expressed preferences, again, these are preferences of a very different system here in the United States, we have different institutions. Donald Trump has almost gone down the entire checklist, from undermining public faith in freedom of speech, freedom of the press, the independent judiciary, the role of the presidency. One of the reasons that you've seen this blizzard of executive orders is not because those evil Democrats control Congress, because they don't, but because there's a belief in a kind of vision of the presidency, I think, that's fundamentally different than our institutions envision.
How much of that is for show? I mean, how much of that is just, popping off and expressing, frustration and venting? Because in the end, it's been 3 months, almost 100 days, and we've actually seen the assertion of other institutions in American democracy successfully, right?
But that doesn't mean it's for show.
Well, but he hasn't ignored orders of the courts. The court said we can't have a travel ban. He didn't dismiss it. I mean, he argued about it. He'd like to, but he didn't.
Right.
Other presidents have toyed with the idea, by the way. Andrew Jackson famously said when John Marshall ruled against him on the Supreme Court, he says he's made his ruling, now let him enforce it. Trump was actually abiding by the court rulings, even as we trashed the judges and
So you're giving him credit for abiding by the judge's rulings?
What I'm saying, if the idea is he's a strong man who disregards or squelches other institutions in society, so far other institutions have stood up to him pretty assertively. Courts, Congress didn't go along with him on the health care bill that he wanted to put through. The media, obviously, I think, has been pretty clear in our independence of him at this point. I think that there are, I think this is actually a sign of the healthy institutions in America that we have a struggle.
Right.
And that
So both things can be true. Just to be clear, I wouldn't want it to be mischaracterized that, I didn't say Trump was acting as a strong man to dismantle these institutions. I said that his preferences, his stated predilections, were almost going down a checklist of the very playbook that all these other leaders, not to mention the fact that these are the people he's publicly expressed over and over again, including not only in his campaign, but even in his presidency, an affinity for. And that includes, for example, hosting and lavishly praising Egypt's military dictator, who came here to Washington before many of our Democratic allies, who's presided over a crackdown that has involved the arrest of thousands of opponents, the killings of hundreds of people, and Donald Trump has praised him, as an excellent leader of his country. And so again, actions and the fact that American institutions have robustly stood up for what they believe to be their role in our democracy and their role in our society doesn't in any way affect the question of why it is that the President of the United States has spoken in these terms about these institutions, right? So what you're describing is not at all incompatible.
Yes,
They're standing up to Donald Trump.
Well, I understand, but it was interesting he likes to get attention, right? And he says attention-grabbing, provocative things. He doesn't always really follow through on them, and that's an interesting dichotomy, right? What did he say last year, Bill? If I become president, she's going to jail, right? He said that about his opponent. That does sound like countries around the world where, if you lose an election, you really suffer a consequence of it. He hasn't done
Egypt.
like Egypt. He hasn't done that. That is not. So there's a part of him or the people around him that doesn't take himself literally. I mean, the line is that his here in Washington, his critics are taking him literally but not seriously, and that his supporters take him seriously but not literally. And there's something to be said for that, by the way. In focus groups, by the way, some of his supporters had asked about some of these more outlandish things he said. They said, well, he says, I don't believe he's actually going to do this or he means that. But broadly, he's going to shake up the system. It isn't good to shake up the system. And so what's interesting or different, you asked at the beginning, what's different about the president, is most presidents expect to be taken literally and want to be taken literally. And this one just sort of says things, and I think I was almost surprised that we take him literally.
And so just in terms of your responsibility as a correspondent covering the White House, historically, journalism is well set up to do a couple of things. One is fact-checking, right? That's not true, whoa. The other thing is basically the hypocrisy watch. And of course, politicians have always provided great fodder, for journalists on the hypocrisy watch because this is not, the province of one party. It's not the province of one particular office holder. It's endemic to the Washington swamp. However, we all seem to agree that Trump, love him or hate him, is a different beast when it comes to issues like credibility, veracity, things like that. But as a correspondent, a lot of people would say, well, see, he's managed to define deviancy down. He's changed your standards. Here you are telling us that, it's not so bad because the institutions stood up to him, or telling us that, he didn't lock up Hillary Clinton. So what? So are you saying that that's a good thing, that he just lied?
No, maybe she should be locked up. That's not my decision to make. My point is not to judge him and say good, bad. My point is to point out observations, to make observations and to make analysis. And the observation is that the rhetoric is not always matched by the action. That may be good, that may be bad. There may be a lot of people out there who are disappointed that he didn't lock her up, or disappointed that he hasn't gone further on some of the checklist things that you're talking about. I'm not casting judgment on that one way or the other. It's not for me to say. It is interesting to note the differences and to note that these institutions have in fact asserted themselves. and to analyze what that means for our society, what that means for this presidency, and what that means for our country.
The executive editor of the New York Times, Team Baquet, made some news at the beginning of the Trump presidency when he said,
You never wanted to do is sit on a stage and be interviewed by your wife. Who's a much better journalist than you are.
and Dean said that he would like the New York Times going forward to call it a lie if the president lied, and he has done so in several instances. Other news organizations have decided, like the Wall Street Journal, that in fact, lie is somehow a subjective word and that we shouldn't use it. Does it complicate your job, that decision that you made? Do you agree with it? What do you do? What is your role?
Is your question, do I agree with my boss?
Let's stipulate that you agree with your boss.
I always agree with my boss.
Let's stipulate that you agree
She
with
used to be
your
my boss, by the way. When we met, she was my editor.
I wasn't technically your boss. What do you think about how it affects your ability to do your job as a White House correspondent? Should we be saying the president lies?
Well, I think what Dean Baquet at the time did, he's approved the use of that word, I think, 3 times, with specific things that President Trump had said. Dean, I respect and completely agree with his judgments on everything.
Just note that very clearly. There should be no ambiguity about it.
But I think that we ought to be cautious about that word, and I think Dean is being cautious about that word. I don't think we should willy-nilly go out there and just call everything a politician says a lie, even if we think it's not fully factually founded or it's spin or exaggeration, because there's the four corners of politics allows for a certain degree of what was it? Mike McCurry had the phrase, telling the truth slowly. That was one way of putting it. Politicians have, and by the way, politicians have sometimes very earnestly believed versions of reality that might not match our set of facts. But I think the word lying to me implies intent, and that's why we ought to be cautious about it. Falsehood does not imply intent. Falsehood says what you said is not true, and here are the facts that say it's not true. Fair enough. I've got no problem with us saying that whatsoever. To say something lies is to put us in the person's head, and I think we should be very cautious about that. Having said that, there are certainly a number of occasions where President Trump has said things repeatedly after being corrected and told and shown that there's no factual basis for it whatsoever, and he continues to say it. In those instances, I think it's certainly fairer to use the L word, because he has knowledge that he is disregarding in order to say something that nobody else would say is true. And it is important for us to serve this role of accountability and fact-checking and truth squatting, and we should do it, and do it for both parties and all politicians. It just happens to be that it's a thriving business right now, fact-checking, and it's important. It is important, and we should make a distinction between where a politician says something that's just blatantly not true, and a politician says something that isn't complete and doesn't choose to use all the facts that we might say. Susan actually started the whole fact-checking movement. I want to tell you that. When she was national editor of the Washington Post, she started a little thing called the Fact Checker, including the number of Pinocchios she would get if you weren't necessarily telling the full truth. That was Susan's invention. She hired a guy named Michael Dobbs and appointed him to be the first fact checker. He was fabulous. Glenn Kessler does it now. It has spread through our business, through PolitiFact and some of these other organizations that are doing it. New York Times does it. We don't have cute cartoon figures, unfortunately, but we now do it as well. So it's I think a great institution. I'm really glad that that you started it. So.
Actually, just to be fair, I didn't. PolitiFact started, I think, around the same time, that same election cycle.
Because we don't want to get too Pinocchio into this.
Exactly. But it is true about the Pinocchios. The beauty of it lasting all this time so improbably was that when Michael was the one who came up with the idea with the Pinocchios, and I think he thought I would say, no, that's stupid. I can't do that. And I was like, oh, I love it. That's great. Yeah, let's get a little design. Let's get a little Pinocchio drawn up and everything. And it was one of those situations that you have sometimes as an editor where they were like, thought I was joking, but really, no, I was like, no, let's do it. That's great. Let's have the Pinocchio.
do that without our own bias, our own partisanship, and that's the real trick. I mean, the really good fact checkers, and there are some really good ones, really look at it in a scrupulous way.
I think Glenn is
terrific.
Terrific at doing it, and he's just the right person. He's a wide-ranging, set of interests. He'll do foreign policy things, he'll do healthcare, he'll do politics. Exactly.
He's willing to skewer anybody.
Yeah, no, he's really, really good at it, and that's important. Because there is no party that has a monopoly on truth-telling in politics, and that's the thing. It's like, trying to understand, in fact, what can we isolate out that truly is different about this moment in time in Washington, that truly is different about Trump's presidency. How much will it normalize, by the way? And, I've taken to asking all of my guests, in this new podcast, which is really meant to be about, sort of America and the world. This intersection of this dramatic moment in America's politics here in Washington, but also clearly we're facing a world that is much more in tumult, much more at a hinge point than we've reckoned with. That the sort of 25 years after the Cold War, there's a real question about, are the institutions that we built, are the political trajectory we presumed we were on, and that lots of others were along for the ride as well, seems to be in question. There's lots of chest beating and plenty of forums these days on, is this the depth of the liberal international order? But so, it's a pretty interesting convergence between this disruption here in Washington in our politics and the more global disruption.
Can I ask you one last question, then we should open for questions by others? France had its first round election on Sunday. Marine Le Pen made it to the second round. She had almost as many as a pro-Europe candidate. Neither of the traditional parties in France even made it to the second round. Is this the continuation of Trumpism, or what will happen on May 7th when they have it thrown?
Well, beware punditry. The U.S. election has taught us all to be humble. When it comes to predicting elections, obviously it's a different system in France, and there's no electoral college. And by having the two-round system, it is a majority rule situation. Her main rivals have dropped out and endorsed Macron, the sort of establishment young outsider. But even he is an outsider in many ways. He's created his own political movement from scratch. His party has been around for 1 year. He's a 39-year-old candidate of a party nobody ever heard of in a very tradition-oriented system. So it's kind of an amazing disruption story, even if Emmanuel Macron becomes the next president of France. This is not a story about things and the status quo anti-prevailing. It seems to me it's a part of the disruption no matter what. And remember, you made the point that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote. She won 3 million more votes than Donald Trump. I was always prepared for the idea that if Clinton won, and we assumed she would win, and I'm sure all you assumed she would win, but that people would overinterpret her victory when in fact the real story was not that Hillary Clinton narrowly won the popular vote in a way that was relatively consistent with the last few elections in the United States, but that 40-whatever% of Americans voted for somebody like Donald Trump. I think the same story is a story in France. It's a story in Britain, where not only did they shock the world by voting for Brexit a year ago, but now they're going to have their own snap elections, and the traditional opposition party in Britain was the Labour Party. In France, the president of France is a socialist. The socialist candidate received 8% of the vote in this last election, is basically destroyed. In Israel, where we very, very briefly were until our plans were disrupted by the Trump victory, the traditional longtime ruling party and traditional opposition party, the Labour Party, basically not a factor anymore. And so I think you've seen a convulsive reordering of politics in all the Western democracies. And it clearly suggests that we're headed for a period of much greater volatility going forward than even the last 20 years. In hindsight, we may look back on them and think that was this relatively quiet interlude, including, by the way, the war on terror and that post-9/11, which in the end, was not something that came here inside the United States. I hope I'm wrong, but hopefully all of you can now jump in and please direct all your tough questions.
If you have a question, let me hand you the, okay, let's start here. And stand up if you will.
One of the pieces of advice that we are getting with the debasing of our institutions that we trust to get us through this period here is to not just trust that they'll help us out and equalize things, but for us to support them from where you sit, what kinds of things can we be doing to support those institutions. And then if I can sneak in a second one, do we really think the world is going to let Russia keep Crimea and continue to agitate on the eastern part of Ukraine?
So I'll take the second one first, and you can do the how to support institutions. On Crimea, the short answer is yes. And even Barack Obama understood that, in practical terms, even the sanctions that were imposed with the consensus of our European partners was basically understood that it wasn't going to change behavior, it wasn't going to change the outcome when it came to Crimea. The facts on the ground there are pretty inalterable, at least in the short to medium term. And remember, Ukraine never was a member of NATO. We have self-defense provisions, the famous Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, which requires us to come to the aid of any NATO member, which is why Putin has not marched into Lithuania or Estonia or Latvia, because they are members of NATO, and we are obligated under the NATO treaty to come to their defense were Putin to do so. Ukraine was not, and that is the reason why he's in Crimea, and I believe that's why he's still there.
Yeah, I think it's also important to remember that unlike, say, the Baltics, it's fair to say probably more Crimeans actually are okay with being part of Russia than, say, the Latvians or Lithuanians. I haven't been there lately, so I say that with a grain of salt. I could be wrong. That's certainly the stories you read from correspondence. On supporting institutions, I think, look, all I can say is buy the New York Times and buy as many as you can. This is really interesting, though. You asked about that, and we have seen a complete surge in business, in our customers, our subscribers. It's just gone through the roof. Every time you hear a tweet out there about failing New York Times building, we get a whole lot more subscribers. It's true. We're over 3 million paid subscribers now, most in the history of the New York Times. Never been anything like that. That's digital and print. 3 million. And on top of that, they did start a program a couple months ago. It's interesting because people wanted to give us money. We don't like the idea of people giving us money. We're not taking foundation money or anything because we might actually want to, investigate a foundation. It's not a comfortable thing for us. So they created a program saying if you want to sponsor a student having a subscription, you can give us money for that. I thought that was a great compromise because it helps get the next generation hopefully involved in the newspapers rather than just Twitter, which is a great thing. And they've gotten 1.5 million student subscriptions now funded from that program just in the last few months. So I think in terms of the news industry anyway, support the institutions that you think are doing a good job.
Well, the one other one I would flag would be the Reporters Committee for the enormous amount of work that is going to go through the courts, and that you can't always bank on who's going to be in the White House, good or bad for business when it comes to journalism. And I think there's going to be a lot of law made over the next few years, and with our business in so much disruption. The threat that Silicon Valley poses to how we've traditionally looked at free speech, combined with an administration that may be more hostile to freedom of speech, and I think it's important.
In fairness, we should point out President Obama was not a friend
Absolutely.
to independent journalism in a lot of ways. He prosecuted more leak investigations than all the presidents combined before him, and a colleague in my office faced legal issues for years because he wouldn't turn over a source on a story. So this is not simply one administration.
No, we've seen an explosion of the, of the security state in ways that have come in pretty direct conflict with the ways in which institutions like the New York Times that have invested heavily in covering national security have increasingly rubbed up against
election here. And I'm wondering, to the extent that you all have also seen this, or anyone's investigated or researched, that a lot of, I guess, traditional Democrats, there was a lot of passivity in this country. And I think there's been some people writing to the effect that, the New York Times, among others, were reporting that, there was an 85% chance that Trump was going to win, so maybe, that Hillary was going to win. So a lot of people didn't go out to the polls. And now I think you see a lot of increased activism, not only in subscriptions, but in town halls. And so was the statistic that I think 47% of the population voted. If you could talk to the passivity, the percentage of people who voted, if that was normal or consistent compared to other elections, and do you see this wave, of increased involvement going somewhere? Will those percentages change?
Yeah, those are great questions. I will point out that when the New York Times made predictions about who would win, I was out of the country. Had nothing to do with it. And the truth is, honestly, I've never thought we should make those predictions. I thought that was always a bad idea for any newspaper to be getting into the prediction game. It's not our job to predict elections. It's one thing to get a poll and say, here's what the poll says today. It's a snapshot of today's voters. It may or may not be true tomorrow. And we're not telling you the way it's going to turn out, but we can say the election's going, da-da-da. And I thought it was a bad idea for us to have, especially, what happened was, the national polls were not wrong. Not broadly wrong. So I looked at this the other day. The Washington Post ABC poll, for instance, had Hillary Clinton winning by 4 points nationally. Well, she won by 3 points nationally. So if polls go, that's pretty darn good. So some of the politicians will tell you, you don't get polls that are that much closer in making predictions. The problems were, there are two problems. One is, it didn't take into account the failure of statewide polls, obviously, in the Midwest. And they also didn't take into account the vast overstatement and exaggeration by pundits who were taking thin, close poll numbers and way overstating what they meant. And coming up with these sort of nonsensical predictions that this means there's a 90%. Well, based on what? Politics is not, in fact, a science. It is as much art as it is science. I know there's all these numbers guys out there want to play money ball, whatever. Politics is still about people, and it's still about emotion, and it's about sentiment, and it's about who got up in the morning and where the weather pattern was bad, and all these things. So I think you're right to call us on that one. On the participation, I looked at the other day, the actual overall voter turnout was higher this last year than it was 4 years earlier. Now that may not be surprising because you had an incumbent running for re-election, it wasn't a particularly dynamic election. There were more people turning out. I do think that obviously Democrats were not as excited as obviously the candidate would have wanted them to be, and that didn't help her. But Susan might have a better chance, a sense of that since she was here on election day and I wasn't.
Look, voter participation in the United States is low relative to almost all other major democracies. And of course, were we to have something closer to universal participation as opposed to merely universal suffrage, we would get different results in our elections. And that's the bottom line. Very interesting. I thought for a long time there was almost a cabal between the two parties. And obviously, look at the technology we carry around in our pockets, in our cell phones. Estonia, a very small country, of course, has electronic voting. And there's no reason if we can pay for things and, order stuff on Amazon, while we're in the shower, of course we can vote on our phones.
Exactly.
And it's no less.
Some of these packages show up at the doorstep.
But the point is, imagine what electronic voting would do to the United States. What if instead of 50% of eligible voters, we had 95% participation? We would have very different Congress. We would have a very different White House. We would have a very different political system in ways that would be bad as well as good, of course. And some of them might be even dramatically bad. The United States is not Estonia. And there's a reason that both parties aren't in the least bit interested in pursuing this. But, just think about that. It's kind of an interesting thought experiment.
Any questions in the middle here? Okay.
What are your views about Tillerson and state, specifically with the elections?
Yeah, so the question here is about Secretary Tillerson at the State Department, what are our views and his relationship with Russia. Obviously, he had been ExxonMobil's chief executive, so he had a prior relationship with Russia and Putin specifically. Putin, in fact, gave him the Order of Lenin. He gave him a
Not Lenin. They don't give that.
Sorry, you're right. Sorry, Freudian slip. He gave an order of something anyway. And so he had a prior relationship with Vladimir Putin. You know, I think he's going to do what the President of the United States tells him to do. That's you know, he has not shown that he plans to defy President Trump in any way. I think he's going to be a loyal lieutenant. He, I think, has tried to show some independence on Russia by talking tough on some of Russia's things, some of Russia's actions, both in the Middle East and at home and on Ukraine. He does not really have much chemistry with Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister. When they got together in Moscow, it was a pretty chilly affair. John Kerry at some point just sort of beat down Sergei Lavrov until at least they had some sort of a relationship. But I don't know, it's interesting. Tillerson has not been a powerful, impactful figure as far as we can tell so far as Secretary of State. He's been very quiet. He doesn't seem to understand that public diplomacy is part of the value of being Secretary of State, that actually speaking to reporters and bringing them on your trips and making statements and giving speeches and answering questions and going on television is how you do the job, partly. Because you deliver messages and you impact how the rest of the world sees us. And he's chosen to be very quiet. Now, it may be, in fairness to him, that as somebody who's never been involved in government before in his life, that he's trying to take it slow, learn the job, not make big mistakes as an amateur coming in from the cold and the learning curve, and wait till he feels more comfortable and confident in the job. He spent a lot of time at the White House with the president these last few months. And so I think it's early to judge, but so far he's been a pretty quiet figure. I don't think he's the dominant figure yet on foreign policy.
Well, and I would just add that it's clear that the Trump White House has decided that they want to run foreign policy out of the White House. That's not a surprise, either with Trump's character and what we know of it, but also is consistent with recent White Houses. And if anything, Barack Obama's White House is almost the example of extreme centralization in the National Security Council being really the major force and decider on foreign policy issues, with a handful of exceptions in which they sort of like, okay, well, we'll let John Kerry go and see what he can do when it comes to Middle East peace, which didn't really work out for him. So centralization in the White House, but the difference with Obama is that that's combined with what appears to be a pretty systematic effort to reduce the scale, footprint, influence, power, and resources associated with American diplomacy. And so you have almost all the major positions still unfilled at the State Department. They finally did nominate a deputy for Tillerson. Like Tillerson himself, this is someone who has zero foreign policy experience, zero. And so that's very significant. You would think that Tillerson being a novice to diplomacy, Trump being a novice to diplomacy, they'd at least want somebody day-to-day running the department who had deep experience of American foreign policy, relationships internationally to call upon, and yet they've chosen to go with an all-green team. In addition to that, Trump has proposed an up to 30% cut in the budget for the State Department, and while members of Congress of both parties don't support that, it's been called dead on arrival. Even the Republicans, no way they're going to go for that, but of course it sets the contours of the debate, and Trump has made it clear he's not interested in using the tools of that kind of stuff. They've openly bragged in the White House, we are going to be, we're a hard power presidency. One of Trump's advisors said, well, our foreign policy is going to be an alpha male foreign policy. We don't want any of this soft power stuff. So we'll see. Again, it's early days, and many presidencies, not just this one, change when they're confronted with how hard it is to get your way. So we'll see. But it's definitely by design and not just because of the personality of Tillerson.
Hi, I wanted to get back to the investigations that we started with. So you've got the House, which is basically not investigating at all. The Senate, which has couple of people looking at something, and then you'd have the FBI, and whatever it comes up with, it's going to be dealing with the Comey problem. Suppose it comes up with something, how do you think that's going to play out in the Trump administration?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think the FBI is feeling very bruised right now by having itself in the middle of politics. It doesn't like to be in the middle of politics. It was there for decades under Hoover. It spent the last 40 years trying to get out of that hole and establish and maintain a reputation for professionalism and neutrality. So Comey's troubles or some of the decisions have certainly created or at least exacerbated a sense of discomfort in the agency. I think they're very determined to use this investigation to prove that they are a professional outfit, that they're not part of a partisan, game one way or the other. And I think Comey has every incentive, at least, to demonstrate his independence if he thinks that there's something there worth investigating. He's a really interesting guy. I mean, he has his own center, and he's political in the sense that he obviously understands politics and he understands the consequences of some of the things he does. But I don't think he's I think my colleagues who did this 9,000 word piece, they found in their reporting, they didn't see a lot of evidence that he's partisan. And so I think he values this idea that he is an independent broker. He did during the Bush administration as Deputy Attorney General. He did arguably under the Obama administration, even though a lot of people faulted him for the way he did it. And I think that if he sees evidence there that's worth, pursuing for criminal prosecution, I think that.
And then will it be prosecuted by Jeff Sessions?
Well, that's the next question. That's the next question, isn't it? I mean, I think at that point you wonder whether or not you get to a special prosecutor situation because it's not tenable to have a Justice Department investigating itself or investigating its own administration or prosecuting certain. But the independent counsel law died after the Clinton administration, unmourned by either party. The Democrats nor the Republicans liked it at the end. The Republicans would tell you how terrible Lawrence Walsh was, and the Democrats tell you how terrible Ken Starr was. So at this point, we don't have a structure really in place that's as clear cut as that one was. So I don't know. Do you know what happens after that?
I think we wait and see what happens in the midterm elections.
Well, yeah.
I think we have time for one last question.
I was in 2015 fall. I was at one of those events with Donald, and I thought I would go to a freak show, but I was astonished. There were a lot of angry people there, hopeless people who didn't know what to do because they didn't have jobs. And none of this discussion here addresses this. And I think the Washington elite is talking to themselves and not to the real people, and they will not go away.
Yeah. Well, I think you're right about that. I think that's absolutely true. I think that's, people often say, how did the media fail last year? They fail every year, right? I don't think that the failure of the media last year was that at least the only failure was that we got the predictions wrong. I think the bigger failure, the one that we as a news industry ought to be introspective about, is how we didn't fully understand the mood of the country that would give rise to Donald Trump. It's not that we didn't understand Donald Trump, it's that we didn't understand our own country. And it is true, we live in a bubble in Washington and New York and so forth. Politico actually had a great piece today by Jack Schaefer, who Susan hired to be their media critic, about a study showing that where journals work is even more concentrated in the big urban, largely democratic centers than it was even in 2008. The death of the newspaper industry and the birth of the internet journalism has meant that now 72% of working journalists who are involved in the newspaper and the internet live in counties that were won by Hillary Clinton. All right? And so that definitely shades the way journalists do our business, and we need to make sure we're aware of that. We need to make sure we're conscious of that. We need to make sure we do everything we can to get out of that bubble and to report in the country. Now, one of the things I think we're doing, even in the Washington bubble, is trying to look at what President Trump is doing to fulfill the promise he made to those people. for this trade deal or do that, does actually create the jobs. You know, by getting rid of the clean power regulations that President Obama put in place, does that mean the coal industry will really come back to life, given all the other factors that are involved there? Is the president actually able to deliver on the promises he made? That's part and parcel of what we do as independent journalists as well. But I think your point is very well taken. I agree with it.
Well, I think it's really important, and this idea that we're all in sort of self-reinforcing fact bubbles or information bubbles now. You know, there's been a structural change, and it affects how you individually consume media, and of course there's more media than ever before for you to consume, and it affects the fact that there's been this disruption in the actual business of journalism that has significantly affected who's producing all those torrent of words, you know, that you're now consuming. And remember too that there's been a geographic sorting of America, and that has occurred over the last decade and a half in a way that is really dramatic. And frankly, those really interesting numbers about the partisan bubble that the media is in, that's happened in a really dramatic way. Red America and Blue America didn't used to be so physically separated, and now, in fact, the single biggest predictor of what your political affiliation is or who you voted for is where you live, and that didn't used to be the case. And you know, I'm sure you all grew up and you had people in your town who were Democrats and Republicans, and maybe they argued with each other, but you know, people had a different sifting and sorting, and they were forced to confront those, you know, from other parties, and there were more marriages across party lines, and there were more, you know, America was integrated in a political sense in a way that now it really isn't. And back in 2012,
I've got some numbers.
yeah, well, he's got the numbers to go with it. It's really dramatic. And so I think what happened is you already had this partisan sorting of America into different places. And remember, the results in 2012 were very similar in many ways to the results in 2016 when it came to who voted for which party and where they lived. The difference is that we're seeing also, I think, this economic disruption, rising inequality in the United States. You're seeing the delayed after effects of the 2008 financial crisis and the very unevenly distributed recovery from it, which is to say that upper middle class and upper class America has rebounded very nicely from 2008, and everybody else did not. And you know, so that's why in the aggregate, right, the numbers show that the economy was growing since then, but it didn't reflect it in the people terms in the way that you would expect. And then look, technology is changing the fundamentals of work and education in a way that, again, is very unevenly distributed. It's happening across the Western industrialized world, which is exactly why we're seeing the same kind of crisis play out in France and in the United Kingdom and across Western Europe. So to me, it's very much part and parcel, which means that, of course, it's the story of our lifetime as journalists, and we've got to do a better job of covering it.
A couple numbers that'll back up what she's saying. Statisticians actually come up with a break point. That break point is 800 people per square mile. So if you live in a place with more than 800 people per square mile, you're twice as likely to be a Democrat. And if you live in a place with under 800 people per square mile, you're twice as likely to be a Republican. In 2012, 98% of the 50 densest counties in America, 98% of them went for Obama. 98%. 98% of the least dense counties in America went for Romney, right? And it's not even just physicality, it's our own attitudes, right? If we're liberal, we watch MSNBC. If we're conservative, we watch Fox. We might read the Huffington Post. We might read the Daily Call. It even extends to our families. So in 1960, about 5% of Americans told pollsters that they would be displeased if their son or daughter grew up to marry somebody from the other party. 5%. By 2010, 33% of Democrats don't want no Republican son-in-law or daughter.
By the way, the number this
49%
year would be so much higher than that. I bet the number for like this year is like, it would be like 85%.
Right, and in 2010, just a few years ago, 49% of Republicans didn't want a Democratic person in the House. So it's we're pulling ourselves apart in a way. What I told my audience the other day is, if you love MSNBC, that's great. Every once in a while, turn on Fox. not just to get your blood pressure going, that's one thing, but actually just listen to what they're saying and why they say. You don't have to agree with them. Try to understand where they're coming from, why, how they see the world differently. And I say the opposite too. If you watch Fox, turn on MSNBC, just see how the world looks. People who don't share your point of view, it'll help. Just how we can't address the problem if we don't at least understand each other. And because the atomization, that's the word I think you've used, of media, is so diversified, which is a good thing in general. But we're not even dealing with the same starting point on fact base, right? Because we don't have 3 networks and 2 newspapers anymore. We have a piece of media for anybody in any type of view you have, all the way from Breitbart on one side all the way to the, whatever would be the equivalent on the left. So anyway, that's what I would recommend. And I guess that's it, right?
Well, please take for sale by our local bookstore outside. It's as relevant today now as it was when it was written about 12 years ago, I believe. But once again, what a fascinating conversation. And thank you for tonight, and also thank you very much for the work that you're doing